All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode. All right, everyone, before we jump into this episode, super excited about our newest sponsor, Reserve. Big shout out to Reserve. They are the easiest way to design, deploy, and govern stablecoins backed by a diverse set of assets with access to DeFi yield and insurance. If you don't know Reserve, we're super excited about them here at Bell Curve. You'll hear more about them later in the show.
We didn't really have a need to raise funds, and that meant we didn't have to compromise on the core goals of ENS and being non-profit and decentralized and a public good. And so the DAO came as a natural evolution in our governance story rather than a need for survival.
All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. We got the last episode of the season here. Super exciting guest. We got Nick Johnson, founder and lead dev of ENS. I have to tell you the title now because you'll hear in the episode I completely botched the intro. So, yeah, Mike, what did you think of this one?
I thought it was great. The reason why we wanted to have Nick on is, you know, one of the themes that maybe some of you sensed if you've been following along with us throughout the entire season is sort of this idea, you know, of, well, where can we borrow lessons from corporate governance and implement them in DAO land? And I think there's sort of another, you know, I think Jason and I are pretty sympathetic to some of those arguments, especially when it comes down to optimizing for good and efficient decision making. But we wanted to have someone who represented not the other side of that argument, but just a different and distinct perspective for what DAOs could be. And that's sort of within the community of people who are dedicated towards building public goods, which Nick was like very firmly in that camp. And he's also the founder and sort of maybe shepherd of one of the most successful DAOs, I think, out there today. So we wanted to get his perspective, and honestly, I came away kind of like really seeing a perspective that I hadn't necessarily thought deeply about, but it was a fascinating conversation. He had some very concrete, very interesting ideas about how DAOs are likely to evolve from here. So I thought it was a great conversation.
Yeah, I did too. Let's get into it. We'll see you guys on the other side. Awesome, everyone. Welcome back to the season finale of Bell Curve, actually. It's been an awesome season chatting with folks. Like, I hope you guys enjoyed last week's episode with Chris Berniski and Fernando. Yeah, really excited to bring this season to a close. And we've none other than Nick from ENS, lead developer. And oh my God, Nick just told me how he wanted to get introduced here, and I completely botched it already. Lead developer of ENS. So that's what I'm going with, Nick. But how did I do there?
That's all good. Close enough.
So guys, Nick, you missed us like 2 seconds before we launched the recording here. We're like, what is the title? And Jason, we got 50% of the way there. But
you'd think I would be able to memorize like two things there, but I couldn't. So Nick, I think it'd be really helpful. There's a lot of I guess more specific questions I have about like running ENS and just operating inside of the DAO there and kicking it off. But I think it would be really helpful to take us actually back to the early days, because when I think about how people launch DAOs today, they launch with a token and this huge fundraise, and you guys did it in a more like bootstrapped way, which is actually very similar to how, like, when I think of the Blockworks story, like bootstrapping
it's
and
near and dear to our hearts.
Near and dear to our hearts, and like kind of similar stories. So I'd love for you to take us back maybe 5 years, 6 years to the beginning days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess perhaps a key difference is that our goal from the start was never specifically to launch a DAO. It was sort of maximal achievable decentralization, and back in the day it wasn't clear that, you know, the structure of DAOs was what was going to survive. You know, at the time when we launched ENS, the only example we had to go on was the DAO, and needless to say it wasn't a glowing endorsement of the structure at the time. So, you know, we started off very cautiously with control over ENS's essential, you know, buttons and levers being controlled by a multi-sig of unlike most teams, not of team members, but of independent individuals in the community. And we moved on from that, you know, progressively as we became confident that the growing ecosystem and that the technology could support, you know, increased decentralization. And so we worked to remove the powers of the key holders, you know, just remove human control entirely, and then to move what remained over to the DAO. And so we sort of launched the DAO, you know, purely definitely as a governance mechanism, because there are some things in ENS that have to be upgradable and have to be manageable and so on. And then there's the question of what to do with the funds raised from registration fees. And we thought the community deserved input in all of that.
When you think about why you actually turned into the DAO, I know you were kind of alluding to that, but why? I mean, a lot of companies back then, they decided to run as these centralized entities, and they raised some money and they got some revenue, and they just kind of kept building, and maybe they raised a Series A and a Series B. You guys took a different approach. What can you dig deeper into that decision?
Yeah, so ENS is very much a public good, and its goal is not to make a return for any shareholders. We don't have any. Its goal isn't to extract maximum value. In fact, its goal is to leave as much value behind as possible for the people using it. And so we were fortunate enough to start off with a very generous grant from the Ethereum Foundation, which kept us going initially. And then, very fortunate that the registration fees and the premiums and so on that are necessary to make ENS work well, to have a system where a few early birds don't get all the worms, so to speak, were also sufficient, more than sufficient, to support us in our ongoing operations. So we didn't really have a need to raise funds, and that meant we didn't have to compromise on the core goals of ENS and being non-profit and decentralized and a public good. And so the DAO came as a natural evolution in our governance story rather than a need for survival.
I've got a question for you there, Nick. I'd be very curious because we've talked a little bit about public goods throughout this season. What was is the desire to be a public good as opposed to like a protocol or an entity or whatever that sort of maximizes profit? Can you just walk us through like what the like how you conceptualize the public goods overall, and then why you decided that to be the mission?
I mean, you mentioned protocols, and I think protocols should all be public goods too. A protocol shouldn't have a treasury. It shouldn't have, as much as possible, it shouldn't have governance. But sometimes that's inevitable. And I guess to me, like I grew up in the 80s and 90s, like as the internet was sort of became a thing that consumers could access, and I was fascinated with how it worked and how the whole governance of it was open through the IETF and RFCs that I could just download and read and learn how the internet worked, and that whole openness and that whole treatment of all of this as a public good and as a thing that everyone should build and improve on made a huge impression on me, and I think it's a very large part of why the internet succeeded as it did. They basically making things for profit necessarily erect barriers to entry. In order to make a profit, you have to extract some value, and I'm not rubbishing making profit. Like, private enterprise obviously makes a great deal of sense, but when it comes to our basic protocols and infrastructure, I really believe they should be operated as something that is a benefit to all, and that makes it far more practical to innovate on top of it.
Why is that, Nick? How come? Like, what's the downside of you guys if you guys hadn't gone down this route?
Back in the day, there was like AOL and the internet, and AOL had like very much the permissioned walled garden approach to things, and it didn't succeed in large part because everyone had to buy into it. In order to use it, they had all of this additional friction set up, and you can kind of make that work if you've got an effective monopoly. Like, for instance, Apple does with the iPhone. But anything short of that, you don't. And even if you make it work, all of the value you're extracting is value that doesn't get sort of reinvested into improving the ecosystem. I think the internet is the thriving thing it is today because nobody had to ask anyone else's permission to, like, invent Netflix or something, Whereas if we had a permission network like the ones before, then innovation is as slow as the slowest regulator, basically.
Okay, I've got a question for you there, Nick. 'Cause you mentioned that all protocols that are part of the core infrastructure layer of crypto should be public goods. So I'd be very curious to understand like how you determine what kind of falls into which protocols fall into sort of the core infrastructure layer, and then what should be more consumer-facing applications.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess maybe it's a fundamentalist position, but I guess anything that is infrastructure for other projects, just about, and I guess it's kind of a know it when you see it distinction. I really think that, for instance, Ethereum should be a public good. I think that L2s should be public goods. I don't necessarily think that, like, just because you provide an API that's consumed by other people, you need to be a public good. It sort of depends what you're bringing to the table effectively. But I really think that basically, if you're encouraging people to innovate on top of your platform, then your platform should be open. And most of the time, that means it should be a public good as well.
What about protocols that maybe sit one layer up there, like the Uniswaps, Aaves? I'd call them like the blue chips of DeFi: Maker, Uniswap, Aave, those folks.
I I guess maybe a better distinction to draw here is the anti-competitive nature of some layers of the platform of the protocol. So we can reasonably expect there to be one or a few large chains going forward, and entry to that ecosystem is really difficult, and they're naturally sort of exclusionary, and that's why I believe they should be public goods. When you look at an ecosystem like DEXs and so forth, like Uniswap, those factors still exist, but to a much lesser degree. A superior DEX can survive and thrive on its merits, and beat Uniswap, and there's less of a sort of they're not infrastructure, they're applications, at least in my mind.
I've got one of the, and I'm probably at the risk of rehashing in sort of an age-old debate, and one that I'm sure you're pretty familiar with. I think from a user perspective and kind of just like an overall human fairness sort of perspective, I think most people sort of intrinsically understand the argument for public goods, right? It's annoying to interact with a service where you're feeling you're just being extracted, to generate profits for some nameless, faceless sort of corporation that has a lot of leverage. On the other hand, that sort of mechanism that we have, this sort of freedmen, generate profits, that's a way of or organizing activity, right? Human activity. That market, right, kind of tells us where we should be spending our time, and it helps allocate resources. How do we do that in the land of public goods, right? Because on the one hand, we want like an infrastructure layer that should power the whole next generation of, economic XYZ that's built on top of that infrastructure layer. How can we ensure that we're getting proper talent to build that layer?
Mm-hmm. It's definitely, it's one of the biggest problems with anything that's built as a public good, effectively. And, and traditionally the answer has been, involvement from government in building something, like that. I think, Web3 has a unique opportunity to turn that round and create self-funding public goods. And a lot of that ultimately relies on sort of maybe non-game theoretically optimal behavior, like, giving back to the platforms that enable your application to work. But it doesn't always have to be like that. So in the case of ENS, we levy registration fees in order for the system to work best, because if we didn't, every ENS name that was of the slightest bit of interest would already be snapped up on the secondary market and almost impossible to use. But a side effect is that we get ample funding to fund our ongoing existence and also make grants to other public goods. So I guess to a large degree, it hinges on people recognizing the value of having these things be public goods and be willing to make contributions to make sure they continue to exist. But there are some places and some people doing, like Token Engineering Commons, doing some really exciting work around trying to make sure that these things are sustainable on their own without relying on people's goodwill necessarily.
Nick, there's something that people don't talk about oftentimes with public goods, which is, I think, the people who start public goods are maybe either, I don't know how much, I don't know if this is too sensitive of a subject, but are already wealthy oftentimes, because to start public goods, you're not chasing money, and maybe first time entrepreneurs or second time entrepreneurs, or honestly, a lot of people who live in America, they want to go build a company and raise money and then IPO or something like that and make money. It's very few and far between that you find people who are oh no, actually I don't really care about the money. Can you just maybe tell me about who, just the makeup of the team that starts this, or the psychology of the team behind this?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess everyone on the team is dedicated to the mission, that we're building, and the idea that this is a public good. But I feel like there's this pervasive attitude, like not just in Web3, but like the wider ecosystem, the world, that in order to work at a non-profit or a charity, you have to be paid badly and sacrifice. And I don't think we should lavishly reward people with like ridiculous salaries and so on. But I think it's totally reasonable to pay people the market rate. I don't think you should have to, be self-abasing in order to build these things. So the people who work at ENS Labs are very much values aligned because that's what we hire on. We want people who believe in our mission, but they're not doing so. We haven't had to make them make that choice. Between doing what they love and doing what pays the bills.
Just out of curiosity, from like the standpoint of issuing a token, right? Like generally when you issue, I know there's a difference between equity and tokens, but when you issue equity, that's like you're selling ownership, and theoretically there's some claim on the future cash flows or the right to influence the governance of the company and stuff like that. ENS has a token, so I'd be curious how you think about tokens in the land of public goods.
It's kind of an imperfect relationship, in the sense that they're the best tool we had available in our toolbox. But they definitely have shortcomings, and the sort of tendency towards plutocracy is very much one of those. We explicitly launched the token as a governance token. We didn't start or provide liquidity to or interact in any way with any of the markets that sprung up. But of course, it's inevitable that you launch something that some people have and other people want, and they'll trade it for money. Our goal, though, has been to keep it very much a governance token, to the degree that's possible with a free market all around us. And, the part, one of the tools towards that is we wrote the ENS Constitution, which was, ratified overwhelmingly, when the airdrop happened, that explicitly states, that the revenues ENS gets will not be dispersed to token holders, basically. The money that comes in is not to be paid out as a dividend or whatever. It's to be used to build and enhance the system and then to reinvest in other public goods.
So that phrase, constitution, that's a little bit of a funny phrase, right? To talk about sort of bylaws of an organization, right? If this was LSU, to be talking about the articles of incorporation or the operating doc or whatever. I'd be curious, like moving a little bit into what it's been like to run a DAO or to start a DAO, right? And kind of, shepherd it from its early days. What did the beginnings of the DAO look like? How is that sort of scaling a DAO as opposed to a small company? And what does it kind of look like today? What are the sort of key structures that people should understand in terms of how it works from a governance perspective?
Can I just add one question to that too, which is like, how do you know?
Questions in there.
Yeah. Let me add
add a fifth question.
How do you know when is the right time? Because if I'm trying to remember the early days of ENS, and I think it didn't launch as a DAO, and then it, like, after you built, you got product market fit, it became a DAO. So like maybe take us back to like, how do you know once something is ready to become a DAO, and then I think get into Mike's questions if that works.
Yeah. I'll answer the questions I can remember in the order that seems sensible to me. ENS didn't launch as a DAO, and there were a couple of main reasons for that. One is that we felt the ecosystem was very unready at the time. Like I said, the only DAO we had examples of was the DAO. The tooling wasn't there, the community wasn't there, the examples of good DAO governance weren't there, and this is one area we didn't want to pioneer when there was so much at risk. And the second reason is that there was still too much human control over essential areas of ENS. One of our goals was in fact to not just decentralize control, but also to reduce it as much as possible while still making the system viable. So, the things that changed were the development of things like the compound governor contract, and then Open Zeppelin's subsequent release of a rewritten version of that, and demonstration of that working in real life. We wanted we felt it was really important that it be actually decentralized and operate on chain and not be the DAO says something and then the 5 people who actually control it agree to do that thing, And the other thing that changed was we were able to reduce some of the human control over ENS. So one of the prerequisites in my mind for moving over to a DAO was that we flipped a switch that meant that even the DAO, even the key holders, there was no privileged entity who could replace the .eth registrar, which means that once you've registered a .eth name for, say, 10 years, no action that anyone can take can affect or revoke or transfer that registration. The DAO, or originally the key holders and now the DAO, can still change the registration and renewal rules, but only with a waiting period. And once you've registered your name, it's yours, it's safe. And I thought that was a really important power to remove from anybody before we handed things over to the DAO. So at least it makes the worst case less bad.
How has it been? I mean, just from look, even just talking to you, you're clearly a very dedicated, very competent individual, right? Who, we were talking sort of before we got on air, and you may think of yourself as an engineer, but having to do like a little bit more of a traditional sort of leadership, management sort of role. I'd be curious, it's like kind of the double-edged sword of DAOs, right? Which is that there's less that's totally dependent on you. But on the other hand, this is your baby, you helped grow this thing and create it. I mean, how has it been to actually decentralize some of that decision-making in practice?
Frustrating at times, worthwhile, but, the further we get from the things that were clearly, defined when we launched the DAO, the more diversity of opinion you expect. And, at times when I feel like I have a clear vision for what the right thing for the DAO or ENS to do is, and other people have a very different vision, that can be quite frustrating to handle. But also, it's essential because some of these times are when the best unexpected input has come. The stuff that's made us step back and go, actually, no, that's a much better approach than what we were, intending to do. And I guess the evolution of the governance of the DAO is a good example of that. Like we started off with, a delegated voting system. So we had delegates, and delegates sort of tried to deal with everything directly. And then that evolved into a system where we elect stewards for different working groups. And those stewards are responsible for day-to-day operations and have access to budget that doesn't require like DAO approval for every single, $500 grant or whatever. And then that evolved into having a lead steward whose job it is to sort of shepherd the DAO as a whole and make sure that everybody's at least sort of facing the same direction, even if they don't agree on where we should be going.
Nick, how do you think about, like, let's say someone's listening to this and they maybe don't spend much time in DAO land, and they're what they probably just heard is like, okay, Nick, well, what I'm hearing is you got a CEO and you got a VP of sales, you got a VP of marketing, you got a VP of engineering, and they've got these teams, and you do a budget at the beginning of the year, and you meet quarterly to review the goals. So what is what is the difference in your mind?
I think the crucial difference is that it is all governed ultimately by the token holders who, represent the people who have a voice in the DAO. And there are a lot of parallels to corporate governance. The crucial difference is that the people governing it aren't shareholders, are there to sort of, further the DAO and so on. And it's built more like a co-op than it is like a for-profit company. I think the people mistake... I have a couple of pet peeves here. One is people think that decentralization means every single person giving their full attention to every single decision. But delegation is both necessary and useful. It's unreasonable, for instance, to expect that every voter in the DAO or even every delegate read the entirety of all of the endowment proposals that were submitted. There was like 8 of them in excruciating detail to develop a comprehensive position. And so I think it was reasonable that you delegate that responsibility to someone to summarise so that you can make a decision on that basis. And if somebody isn't upholding their position, the crucial thing is, of course, they can be replaced, they at the next election or earlier if need be. I think the fact that we're decentralised shouldn't stop us from borrowing the sensible things from corporate structure where they help us, build a system that actually works and doesn't just get caught up in bike shedding the whole time.
I'm not hypothetical here by you. I think so the main value prop that you said was, you've got the main difference in that system versus maybe the corporate system is that you have all these like individual stakeholders. And at the end of the day, yeah, maybe you have like, you do these things that look like corporate governance, but really you have all these individual token holders who manage the thing. Let's say let's say in 2023, a couple of big funds come along and they're like, man, ENS looks like a screaming buy. We're going to load up on ENS right now. And the token holders like, interesting. I'm really behind this mission, but also bear market would love to make some money. And they sell to these VCs. And now you have 3 VCs who own the majority of the tokens. How does that, how do you think about that situation?
It's probably my biggest hesitation and risk over, over decentralizing into a DAO that's token driven in the first place. And the defenses against it, I think, are mostly partly social and partly financial. And so, from the social point of view, the tokens were given out, 25% to people who had participated in the ecosystem, and we tried to weight that towards people who had been involved for longer and who showed a longer term commitment to ENS, which hopefully means some dedication to seeing that it continues to work. And 25% to the people who helped build the system, which means, myself and the team and other external contributors have a significant interest in seeing it continues to function. And so from the social point of view, I certainly hope that in a situation like that, there will be enough holdouts who resist the profit motive in order to help ensure that this continues well into the future. And, the Constitution also helps act as a friction mechanism against doing that. From the financial point of view, I hope that the goal is that it continues to be cost ineffective to buy up enough tokens to extract the value from the treasury. You would have to pay more to take over ENS than you could possibly gain through doing so. And, part of the way we can continue to ensure that's the case is to continue to put those funds to good use on public goods and other ecosystem initiatives so that we don't have this massive war chest just acting like a big, come get me sign to any corporate raiders.
I have to admit, Nick, you had to make me look up the term bike shedding. I know I've heard that before.
Yeah.
But I
there
had
is
to give it a Google.
Yeah, but there is an in-joke in the team that I use like neologisms all the time. And that, every day there's like some word or phrase that they've never heard before. And every so often one of them will be like, no, there's no way that's a real thing. You're having it on this time. And they'll look it up and no, it's a real thing, And then the joke is that eventually I'll just start dropping nonsense words in there and nobody will call me on it.
Do you just love vocab, Nick? What's this? Do you just?
I guess so. It's a combination of that and being a Kiwi and therefore having a slightly different dialect and all of our own slang and stuff. And having, I've lived in New Zealand, Ireland, Australia, and the UK, so I guess I've picked up some of that from a bunch of places.
Nick, you should try to drop a fake word into this conversation and see if we call you out for it. And let us know.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll do my
audience
best.
as well. Yeah. All right. Yeah. All right, everyone. Brief break in the show here to talk about our newest sponsor, Reserve. So, it's looking pretty bleak out there. It's not looking that great. But you know what? The one thing there's no bear market in?
Stable coins.
Stables, baby. Stables. We love those stable coins, which is why we're excited to partner with Reserve Protocol. So let's just start with the basics. What is Reserve? It's a self-service platform to build, deploy, and govern asset-backed stablecoins, which can be integrated with DeFi or within the real economy. So the cool thing about Reserve is basically anyone out there permissionlessly can take any set of ERC20 tokens and use them to collateralize their own stablecoin. So the long-term goal of the Reserve Protocol is to create a non-inflationary currency that is stable on a month-to-month basis, but also a century-to-century basis. In the meantime, though, they're open sourcing design decisions for stablecoins, which is just super, super cool. I think one of the benefits that you get there is diversification. You hear it all the time in Finance 101, no such thing as a free lunch except for diversification. That's what you're getting with Reserve Protocol.
Yeah. I've known the team for a long time. I spoke on a panel at SF Blockchain Week with Nevin, with Joe Carlson and Alex Gladstein. Really impressive growth that they've been able to have so far, right? Their premier stablecoin is RSV. It is backed by 3 other stables. It's already used by over 500,000 people, transacting over $300 million a month. right now, like Mike was talking about, anyone can go create a custom bespoke stablecoin using the Reserve protocol. You can back it by maybe specific USD stables, or you can get creative and maybe build something more complex like inversely correlated assets. The branding, governance, and composition are completely up to you.
And lastly, if there are any builders who are listening and you aren't interested in issuing your own stablecoin, what you can do is you can stake Reserve's governance token against your favorite stable strategies. So what you're doing there is you're providing backstop insurance to stablecoin holders. Not riskless, right? Not financial advice. There's definitely some risk in doing that, but it does allow you to earn yield, especially now in crypto when there are so few ways to do that. It's definitely worth checking out. So at the very least, you should click the link at the bottom of this episode. Go check out the Reserve website. See all the cool stuff they're up to. Most importantly, though, click this link. You got to give Jason and me some credit here.
Show us some love. Show us some love.
Give us some love, baby. Give us some love. All right. Now back to the show.
Let's get into it. One of the things that's happened is you had this you had this vision. You were locked in on where ENS was going to go, and the more people that join your team, naturally, the maybe more people disagree with where that vision is going, and some really good things have come out of it. What have been the downsides of that? Have there ever been times where you've basically been sitting there and said to yourself oh my God, I know we've got this mission, but my God, I wish we just had a centralized company where I could make some decisions pretty quickly right now?
The fortunate thing is we've got the DAO and we've got ENS Labs, and ENS Labs kind of is a centralized company in the sense that, myself and Corey, our executive director, run it. Everyone's hired as a contractor for it, and we get a budget from the DAO. So we're still accountable to them, but, we're able to make our own decisions. We don't have to be micromanaged by the DAO for exactly how the design of the new manager should look or stuff like that. So I feel we've got a reasonable trade-off there. And I think the whole sort of development org thing, as long as it can be meaningfully fired by the DAO, if it turns out to just be a way to, funnel cash to the owners, is another good way to do this. And in fact, I kind of hope that we'll see other development orgs with parallel non-intersecting goals spring up and also be funded. I would love to see other companies that are building ENS in other ways, also be just as essential to the DAO as we are today.
I have a couple questions around voting and some of the mechanics around voting. So, right now it seems like the pervasive method for voting in DAOs is one-to-one token voting. I'd be very curious about do you think that's the final end state for how voting and decision making happens in DAOs?
It's a difficult problem because the alternatives all pretty much rely on some way to prove individual identity. Things like quadratic voting are really elegant, but they only work if you could solve the Sybil problem. And, that means being able to prove that somebody is an individual human, so that you can't just spread your tokens around 10 different accounts that you claim are 10 different people. And there's a bunch of systems that try and solve this. They're pretty much all centralized, so you're effectively giving a gatekeeper control over who can participate in governance. And even if they weren't, they have significant drawbacks. Even if you imagine a perfect proof of identity system that can somehow just tell who the individual humans are, trustlessly and without, zero knowledge, you could still just literally go out on the street and offer $50 to anyone who lets you use their identity for something they don't care about and will never touch. And probably about half the people you approach would be like, yeah, sure, what's it to me? So it really does have some significant drawbacks, but I'm not aware of, I just haven't seen a system that seems robust enough to replace it.
There was a proposal a little while ago. I can't remember what it was for, but I think it was Arca that opposed it, but it was something to the effect of a VE locking mechanism when it came to governance, where you would take your tokens and you would you'd stake them, right? And you'd say, hey, I have these decisions about how I think the protocol should be run, and I'm going to put my money where my mouth is, and I'm going to stake this, right, for some period of time, or put some up for that could, I guess, that wouldn't be getting slashed, but they would be, I'll put them at stake. And I don't know, I think there was a lot of pushback on it. I personally thought it sounded super interesting. I as someone who is founder at a small business, and I can imagine what it would be like to have publicly circulating stock. And you listen to these things about Carl Icahn coming in and demanding that you need to stop doing what you're doing. And sometimes I'm with Carl Icahn, but sometimes I'm like, come on, dude. Like, let's be honest about what this is. You got here yesterday, and I do think that there's some interesting premium on being able to like put your money where your mouth is and lock up your tokens and get like outsized voting because you're putting your economics at stake. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a mechanism I've seen before, but haven't really considered in detail for the DAO. I do think it's a really interesting mechanism because, yeah, just to expand on what you're saying, it provides a way to show that somebody is long-term committed to the organization and therefore, get rewarded with a larger voice. Lock my tokens up for a year. That implies at least that I'm not going to make any decisions that imperil it in the next year because I have this strong vested incentive to continue to be, that it continue to be useful. I guess there are always workarounds for this as one issue. Like, if there's a mechanism by which you can short tokens, then you could lock up the tokens and then you could short them and have a net neutral position but still get all the voting power benefits. It's likewise, one of our devs has been working on a way to basically wrap the ERC20 voting token in an ERC 1155 wrapper, meaning that so the current situation is an account delegates to another account. So all the tokens you have are delegated to someone else. If I send 10 of my tokens to you, they're delegated to whoever you delegate to, or nobody if you haven't done that. The idea with this wrapper is that you would have like a different type of token for each delegate, and they'd all be interchangeable, but I could send you some Makoto tokens or some Jeff tokens or some Vitalik tokens that are delegated to that person, and they would remain that way. And the advantage here would be that often we see a lot of like gradual loss in voting power because people move tokens between accounts or they trade them or whatnot, and they lose that association of being delegated. But the problem is, and so you could also incentivize this. You can say, if you you do this, you can stake your tokens and so forth against somebody, and you get rewarded proportional to how much they participate in governance. Because you want to encourage people to delegate to people who are active. But like everything else, this is so gameable. You can just imagine someone will set up a robot that. Like a contract that owns tokens and votes no on every proposal, regardless of what it is, and therefore automatically gets 100% of the participation bonus. And then they'll write a wrapper that wraps your tokens in, to delegate to this. So they're once again just regular ERC20s. They work as before. Only now we've got an active disincentive to do the very thing we wanted to make people do. It's so tough to design these token economic systems such that not even just that they can't be gamed, but so that there's at least no incentive to game them. I would be happy with a zero incentive. You can do this, but you won't gain from it.
We posed this question in one of our previous episodes, and it's very easy for me to see kind of almost like the end state of what we are, like the benefit, I think, of decentralized governance and what you're talking about here is resilience. Ultimately, I think it's pretty hard to make an efficiency argument, but with the right sort of tranche of protocols, ones that are sufficiently necessary to the infrastructure of what we're trying to build in crypto, I can see a huge premium for resiliency. But a lot of the times what ends up happening in society is not even necessarily because there's an Overton window that shifts where people decide we want to value this as a society. And the example that we talked about in a previous episode was power companies. They're natural monopolies. They could charge infinite, right? They could charge because we all need power and we'll pay whatever it was. But we at some point as a society were look, we all want access to power here, right? So we're going to limit the return that these utility companies are allowed to realize on their capex, what they invest in their business. Where that hasn't happened really is financial infrastructure. We could sit here until we're blue in the face and talk about how it's great. It's a public good. Everyone should have access to their own banking and financial apparatus. But it's clear that in Washington, at least, they do not believe that. They just don't believe that that's the case. So how would you respond to that? Like, how do you respond to this guy? Do we need to wait for an Overton window to shift and society to care about this and our lawmakers and policymakers to care about? What do you think about that idea?
I think, yeah, I think that waiting or pushing is just about the only approach, really. Like, I would. I'm very far from a libertarian myself, and and so many of the things that some of the crypto community espouse, I'm like kind of skeptical of. But then there are other areas in which I can't help but agree, and so things like financial privacy, the general sort of rubbishing of the idea that you might actually want financial privacy really bugs me, and the fact that it's just been normalised, like all of these KYC measures, which it's been demonstrated don't really effectively reduce money laundering, but they do eliminate any hope of financial privacy. The fact that these are just uncritically accepted as necessary to stop, money laundering and terrorism financing and so on, when the evidence is they do no such thing, is really depressing. And the Tornado Cash thing is a great example of this. A lot of people aren't aware, but the Tornado Cash devs actually built in mechanisms for compliance. Basically you could, if you saved the receipt from your Tornado Cash withdrawal, you could generate a proof that you could provide to, say, an exchange that proves where the funds that went into Tornado Cash came from, so that removes that layer of anonymity it provides just from the people you agree to provide it to, which is pretty much perfect. And it means that you can have anonymity from unknown people on the chain, but if you need to KYC yourself, if you need to prove where the money came from, you can do so cryptographically. That mechanism was just completely ignored by, OFAC and by, the Dutch prosecutors and so on, and they treated them as building a money laundering facility, when in fact it would be exceptionally poor at money laundering, because with all the KYC and so forth, what exchange is going to go look at it and go, oh, we can't see where the money came from? That's fine then, problem solved. But none of that matters, because the current prevailing political opinion is that anyone who wants financial privacy must be a criminal, and so the facts of the matter don't seem to be relevant.
Nick, I actually think we could do a whole nother episode on financial privacy, but we'll save that for another one. No, I actually just wanted to go back to some things you said like 20 minutes ago about like the base layer should be DAOs, but other things on top of that are applications. Do you think that all of the base layers have already been built? And the secondary question there is like, will we have any more DAOs? Should any more DAOs launch, or like is it basically just like figure out the current base layer, make those into DAOs, and then just build apps on top of all this stuff to make it useful?
Mm-hmm. I guess to address them in order, no, I don't think all the base layers have been built. I think maybe we've seen the types of base layer we can expect, things like L1s and L2. But there are definitely more to be made. I think we'll see exciting new L2s. I think we'll see innovations in the zero knowledge space, all manner of things along those lines. And I think many of them will be public goods or should be public goods and should have DAOs. But also more broadly, I don't think a DAO necessarily can only govern a public good, or can only govern a platform. I think DAOs are a perfectly good structure for a for-profit entity as well. Again, in either case, as long as you build the right governance mechanisms to make things actually happen, and other than argument.
Do you think any of the L2s are approaching it in the right way right now?
I think Optimism is a public benefit corporation, and I find that enormously encouraging. Arbitrum, I'm less certain about their underpinnings, but I think they also take a generally open approach, which I think is really encouraging. I'm a little more sceptical of the approach of some of them like Starknet, where they're like, oh, we're going to develop closed first and then open things up later.
Raise a lot of venture money.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I've always felt pretty skeptical about that, because and it's similar when people are like, oh, we're going to open source the code at V1 or whatever. I'm like, I've always been like, just let it all hang out. The code's a mess. That's fine. Just say, in the README, the code's a mess. Nobody is going to like shun you because your first version didn't have perfect unit tests. And it's never realistically never going to be perfect. So if you wait for that perfect moment, it will never come. And you get so many benefits from open sourcing and sharing and building an ecosystem even around bad code because it gets better.
You mentioned some of the mechanisms, right? So one of the reasons why you didn't launch ENS originally as a DAO is because there were some key mechanisms that didn't exist, like the governor contract. So what are some of the other, it's hard to point to pieces of trustware that don't exist yet, but what are some of the other mechanisms that you think may exist, or what are some of the gaping holes from an infrastructure standpoint that exist to manage DAOs?
Yeah, I mean, I think, on-chain DAOs like Compound were a key development, and it's the idea was obvious, but, building it and auditing it is a major lift. I think there's a lot more progress to be made there particularly around tooling, off-chain and on, but mostly off, like for proposals and proposal management and day-to-day DAO governance could get an awful lot better. What we do now is a sort of strung together combination of like Gitbook docs, discourse forum, tally for voting on chain, snapshot for voting off chain, synchronizing everything manually between those. We've had we've had one vote that I had to embarrassingly ask everyone to vote down because I made a mistake when moving it from one place to another. Something that sort of unifies all of that and is usable across DAOs is a really important development that just hasn't happened yet. Various people are tackling small parts of it, but nobody seems to be building the whole thing. In terms of like on-chain components and contracts and so on, Open Zeppelin released their version of the governor contract, which is based on Compounds but is a complete rewrite. And they've made it really modular, which is a really excellent starting point. I think ENS DAO was one of the first ones to use it. But the fact it's modular makes it easier to innovate in this area. So you could, for instance, swap out the ERC20 voting token for like an 1155 token, or, for quadratic voting, or whatever you see is suitable.
How do you think, from even zooming out a little bit from the specific mechanisms, how do you see them evolving? Let's just say, I don't know if this is your belief, but crypto is going to continue to be cyclical for a little bit. Innovations sort of get made in bear markets, and then we see them through to the next bull run, and there's innovation that happens along the way. Like, what do you think some of the big differences are going to be in the next sort of bull run for DAOs? Do you see the majority of protocols being organized, in like a more true to the idea on-chain version of a DAO, or what do you think?
I think we'll see more standardization and more professionalization in a way. The template of how to launch and run a DAO will become better established through the successes of the DAOs that do well and the failures of the ones that do poorly. And we can expect there to be more people who are, professional delegates and so forth. And that comes with pros and cons. The cons being more lobbying and more sort of, ossification of governance and also potentially governance capture. The pros being that we have more people who actually know what they're doing from the start and aren't feeling their way through this for the first time. I think those are going to be the main trends in the next few years at least.
Is there anything in particular that you're excited for in your, either in your domain or for ETH as an ecosystem, or tell us something that you're excited about that might not be as obvious to some of our listeners?
For the DAO, I'm excited about us moving to a longer term vision and more sustainable sort of approach. I sort of started the conversation around an endowment, and its goal isn't to weather this downturn or the next one. It's to make a DAO that can last 50 or 100 years, and I don't think many people are thinking about that. For ENS, I'm kind of excited about some of the stuff we're pushing out now with off-chain names and so forth, and L2s and so on, that will make it possible for everyone to get a name without paying transaction fees. And we're even integrating with DNS in more more functional and low-cost ways to enable that with DNS names as well. And for the wider ecosystem, I guess I'm excited about the fact that Ethereum's ecosystem continues to be lively and not ossified and willing to make innovations. We're talking about things like the Ethereum object standard, about dank sharding and so on, to continue to evolve the platform in the direction it needs to go, and that we haven't fallen into the trap that Bitcoin had already fallen into by this point of resisting all change, no matter how well considered.
What's the greatest risk to ENS right now, Nick?
I think probably two things. One would be governance in action because of internal disagreements and because of a fear of making changes or taking risks. We have this big discussion going on around financial management, and there's a lot of people who are very cautious about doing anything other than just sitting on ETH. And I worry that caution actually blinds them to other risks, that we incur by being in that position. And the other one is the one you alluded to, is governance capture. We try to make it as unaffordable and unattractive as possible, but there's still the possibility someone comes along and manages to swing a vote in the direction they want purely because of their vested interests.
Would you say those are the two biggest risks to DAOs in general, not just ENS?
I think that's a reasonable take, yeah.
Yeah. Have you created a fake word yet and put it in this conversation?
I've created one, but I haven't found a way to work it in yet.
Nice.
And I've got a couple of real ones.
I think I was cheating by asking that. Shoot, okay.
Yeah, you were.
Okay, I got one more question for you, Nick, which is just on the value of community, which is something that we've been trying to suss out, which is, if you rewind the clock about a year ago, the value of DAOs was really in the community, and you have your, it was like find your 1,000 true fans or whatever. It was like kind of that idea, but for shipping products. And you start with the community, and you've got this great pipeline already into them. And talking to some of our people on this season, there's pushback against that idea. So I'd be curious to get a sense of how you think about the value of community in a DAO.
It's been mostly pros and a few cons. The few cons to start are there are always a few people in a community who are very loud and very sure of themselves, but also very sort of single-minded on some topic that is their pet topic, and they can easily derail conversations for as long as you'll let them. You can end up in a situation where everything becomes about the pet topic and nothing can get done, because everything just sort of gets derailed into these endless circular conversations. But the enormous plus has been attracting so many more people who are enthused and dedicated and want to work on this and build this than I could have foreseen. The part of it's been the growth of ENS in general, but part of it has been the outlet the DAO has provided, for these people to actually make meaningful contributions. And I've really seen it since we launched, for instance, the small grants rounds, where every month 5 projects get an ETH each to help kickstart them. Just the number of things people are building, in and around the DAO because they have a feel that, they can make a meaningful contribution here, and that, they're allowed effectively, just giving them permission to be involved.
I think those are all the main questions that we have. I guess, Nick, you get the final word on the entire season, my friend. If people take away one sentence from this entire season on governance
pressure,
and
Nick,
the
no
promise
pressure.
of DAOs, no pressure. What do you want people to take away?
No pressure, yeah. I guess one of the biggest problems DAOs face is that people decide for themselves that their voice isn't useful or valuable, or that they can't make a meaningful contribution. And so often low participation is because people have pre-selected themselves out of it. And I think more people need to realise that actually you don't have to be in some special position. You don't have to have a track record. You don't have to be a prominent individual to make a meaningful contribution.
Well said, Nick. Well said. You have certainly been our most verbulose guest of the season.
Verbulose, great.
That was my made up word. I didn't know if you dropped
I
one
figured.
in there,
Yes, I did pick that. Yeah. I asked DALI to make up some words related to cryptocurrency, and it came up with cryptotecture, which is the architecture and design of cryptocurrency technology and systems. So I was going
Oh,
to try
wow.
and slip that one in.
Good
Oh
picture.
man,
Yeah.
you guys, I wouldn't have questioned. I
That's
wouldn't have
that's
thought
the
twice
theme
about
of
it.
season 3. Theme coming
Crypto,
up.
crypto picture, yeah. Nick, it's been a real pleasure having you on.
Yeah, this was fantastic, man, and congrats on everything with ENS. It's been awesome seeing you guys grow and become this like backbone of the industry. So yeah, keep on doing you.
Thank you.
Great episode. That was a lot of fun.
I just like Nick. I've DM'd with him a lot. One time there was like this. I was trying to buy a name on ENS, and I messaged him, and he was like, basically went into customer support mode and really helped me out, and we just exchanged a bunch of DMs. But this is the first time I've ever talked to the guy, and I just really like him. He's very mission driven, but not in like a crypto maxi mission driven type of way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I got the impression that he genuinely is some person who's motivated by trying to do good things, improve his surroundings, and he's clearly someone who has a very strong work ethic as well. So it's very cool because I think his perspective was a little bit distinct from some of the other people that we've talked to so far in this season, and I thought it was a great, very true to the ethos of what we're trying to do here in crypto and with DAOs, and I just loved it as a conclusion for the season.
Yeah.
So
I did too.
Yeah.
Tell me a big takeaway. Tell me what you're thinking about after that episode.
Yeah, I really think he helped cement for me. Sometimes it's funny to hear someone just really believes it themselves and he just had a very clear-headed, not some big crazy vision of the future, but it was just very easy for me to walk away with this idea that, look, if you're building the base layer infrastructure of a new financial system, then yeah, you want to be optimizing for good decision making, but really you want to be optimizing for resilience as well. And if you use the analogy of, this is the one that people in crypto love, but TCP/IP and HTTP, those open early internet protocols, which are a really good example of really public goods, that a lot of the modern day internet is built on. I think there's a very compelling case where, yeah, you do sacrifice a little bit of efficiency and good decision making in the early days of a startup, but I think the premium that you get for the resiliency and the environment that you create for other for-profit entities or companies to build on is immense. So I just walked away thinking there's a lot of merit to what he was talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree. What did he? So he had his thesis is that public good should be DAOs here in crypto land, and so something like ENS should be a public good.
Well, what I heard him say is that he thinks all protocols that are close to the infrastructure layer.
To the infrastructure layer, yes. Okay,
yeah.
good point. So what did he say again about Uniswap and like Aave?
He actually drew the distinction, I think, one that we've talked quite a bit about. And you can look at, I personally wouldn't necessarily put Uniswap in the bucket of a public good. I would, because, and I think he was making that argument as well, unless I'm totally misunderstanding, because Uniswap is an application. And there's probably, at the end of the day, I don't know, you hear this come up a lot in discussions about Uniswap v3, and all right, now we've solved liquidity, it's already has the most dominant market share, so everything should be, that's the public good, and then we'll build stuff on top of that. And I'm just not necessarily I'm not convinced that that's actually how it works. Like, you need to find a way to maintain that competitive advantage for Uniswap. It's a financial exchange. I'm not really sure why that should be a public good, but I think what he, definitely, I don't think that you would hear many other people arguing that Ethereum should be anything other than a public good. Bitcoin should be a public good, in my opinion, as well.
What he's dealing with is the same thing we're dealing with. Centralized company or decentralized company. It's people management and creating incentive plans. And it's just funny to hear that's the exact same thing that he's working on. And it was interesting to, that seems to be, I know he mentioned his two greatest fears at the end, but it seems like the biggest thing that maybe keeps him up at night on a more short-term basis and more in the now is just how do you incentivize people? How do you create incentive systems that propel the DAO forward?
Yeah. I think if you zoom out far enough, everything is about people management and incentive creation. What
do you think about his biggest fear being the VCs? And I think that got him thinking.
I think he had already thought about it quite a bit. And I don't even think this is the VCs getting undue influence. We talked about this in the last episode with Chris, where I really am of the opinion yeah, that all the people right now who are saying, yeah, no way, I'm not going to buy in, are the same people who are going to be ripping VCs for getting outsized allocations. Like, this opportunity is there for all of you. Right now, it's VCs. In TradFi land, this is more sort of in the land of hedge funds, in the realm of hedge funds, I think, kind of like vulture funds, or it's kind of like the bad side of, what do you call the funds at Carl Icahn? Activist investors. Sometimes activist investors actually come in and they say, hey, like the way you have governance set up here is not necessarily proper, or I don't think you're doing what's in the best interest of the shareholders here, and they're supposed to be these white knights. I bet that's true like half the time. Probably the other half of the time, there's a little bit of corporate raiding being done and a lot of profit extraction, frankly, from businesses that were probably fine. And I think the analogy is probably more to like activist investors like Carl Icahn than VCs. Right now VCs is sort of the boogeyman because they're the active professional capital class in crypto. But eventually, I think what ends up standing in there is hedge funds, basically. And yeah, I think and people worry about this in corporate America all the time. That's why they have like poison pills, and that you hire fancy investment banks like Lazard or whatever to help you protect against active investors coming in and just buying up a whole bunch of shares and then taking control of the company, and then in the worst case, extracting a whole bunch of profits and harvesting value instead of creating new value. So yeah, I think it's a valid concern. I think the reason it probably hasn't happened yet is because probably a lot of people that would be sophisticated enough to try a stunt like that don't believe that you're doing value buys in a lot of these companies right now. Like, they're sort of protected by their own high valuations. But yeah, probably will be a concern eventually.
Anything else from the app?
I had an enormous amount of fun this season. I think I want to digest some thoughts before we come back with our like full list of takeaways.
We'll do one more app. We'll do a recap app. And
yeah. Also, Jason and I we are between two topics for next season. I'd be very curious, anyone who's listening and who's made it all the way so far in this episode, if you guys have topics that you'd like to see Jason and I explore deeply, would love to get your feedback.
This is the topic for season 3. So if you tweet at Mike or tweet at me, and let us know what you want the topic for season 3 to be.
All right, buddy. This was a fun one. I'll see you on the other side.